So, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm delighted to be here. Appreciate you taking time from your busy schedules to learn about the forest. Again, I'm Thomas Sutphin. I was the first forest manager of the forest. I started in 1990 when the forest was dedicated. And before I get started, though, I'm curious of you folks here, how many of you been to the state forest? Woo, most of you. That's fantastic. And then, how many of you been on one of the walks that have been put on either last year or last summer or in previous years? Any of you done that activity? Very good. Oh, cool. So just about all of you have been there, which is fantastic, right? So let me get started here. So my goal is to start at the beginning and cover Native American use of the area of the forest all the way up to the present. So a few hundred years in less than an hour. I have many images to show you, and so we'll move right along. Hopefully I don't overwhelm you with detail or put you to sleep here. And my laser pointer. So, this is the view from Highland Way. And this is one view of the state forest here with Olive Springs Quarry in the background and the Monterey Bay farther still. And it's, the forest now is about 80 to 100 years old. The quick summary, Soquel Demonstration State Forest, managed by CAL FIRE, the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. It's about 2,700 acres. It's managed for watershed protection, managed for forestry research, protecting the old growth river, demonstrating all kinds of innovative practices, including sustained yield timber management. That's kind of in a nutshell what the state forest is about. Here it is within the Soquel Creek watershed. You know that the West Branch and the East Branch then come together and drain down in Capitola. The Esplanade, that's where all the water ends up, right? So that's kind of the natural boundaries, right? And then we add the roads with this image. Soquel San Jose Road here. Summit San Jose is here. Nicey Marks is next door. This is where the office and fire station are located. And this boundary here is the East Branch of Soquel Creek. The next couple images one will be from Highland Way looking down the canyon, and the other one will be from Spanish Ranchers, which is right here looking up the canyon. And then this is Long Ridge in here, and the Amaya Basin there to give you some kind of orientation. So here we are, Highland Way, looking down Soquel Creek at the bottom. That same view of the forest with Spanish Ranch here on the side, and Long Ridge over here, and Amaya Ridge here. It's amazing how resilient the forests are, right? This area was clear cut in the 20s and 30s, and then came back, and now it's from this area down has been now selectively harvested, and yet from a distance you wouldn't really recognize that. Again, so this is now looking up canyon with Soquel Creek at the bottom, Highland Ways here, Loma Prieta's, the mountains up here, and then this is the Sulphur Springs area. You can see this area has more hardwoods, more tan oaks, more black oaks, right? This is the picture of that same view taken about 90 years ago. And here's Loma Prieta at the top. Sorry, it's a little blurry, but we have this photo set taken in 1937, and it's just pretty remarkable. And I can't help but think that with the Native American burning, that it was more open in the past than it is now. I have this one of just a few pictures of the area of the forest in the watershed before it was harvested. You know, this shows a really dense old forest. I'm sure it wasn't like this everywhere, but there were, you know, probably in the it was that dense. And then another photo, this one taken in 1937, you know, of the forest. Pretty dense, you know, before it was logged. And then with this photo is a reminder that I want to acknowledge the native peoples, you know, lived here first, managed this area for thousands of years. They, you know, the Ohlone of the Bay Area, Monterey Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, you know, had many different subgroups. The subgroup here in the Soquel watershed probably didn't live up in the forest year-round. They would come up and gather acorns in the fall. There's a bedrock mortar where they ground the acorns or do hunting. You know, they were just an amazing culture. You know, here are some of the things they gathered in the forest. This obsidian knife blade that's about 5 inches long was found in the forest. Just, you know, amazing stuff. This is a photo of Patrick Orozco, taken a while back, just to give you some kind of flair of idea of, he's been fostering the native culture for many years, and he's in his ceremonial dress for dancing. You know, this is on special occasions, and he's been doing this now for many years, but I wanted just to include that because, you know, there aren't many images of the Native Americans in this area. You know, amazing baskets. And then as Roger said, kind of the key part for this story is how they actively managed the forest with, you know, regular burning. You know, and they did that to keep the land open, to foster the plants that they wanted to utilize, and to keep it open for hunting. So we're actually now trying to get back more into forest conditions more like this, right? And this is actually in the Sulphur Springs area. All that changed dramatically, of course, when the Spanish arrived, built the Santa Cruz Mission, and rounded up the Native Americans. It's my understanding that it was so devastating that for the group that lived in the Soquel watershed, that there are no living descendants anymore. So pretty devastating. The next major period was the Mexican period, you know, starting 1822. And that's significant for us because of the Mexican land grants, right? So with the land grants, there was private ownership. And for our area, it's the Rancho Soquel down here, Soquel Capitola, and the Rancho Soquel Augmentation, which was an additional 30,000 acres that was given to Martina Castro Lodge, you know, one of the early settlers during the Spanish period. This area she had many kids, and they had spouses, and this area was divided up into dozens of tracts that were then, she acquired this in the 1840s and gave and sold portions of it to her family, and they in turn sold it to the settlers. So this was quickly divided up into multiple ownerships. Then the next big player, many of you probably have heard of F.A. Heen, very wealthy, powerful man, you know, one of the biggest names in Santa Cruz history. He started to acquire the property within the Soquel Augmentation. Here's where the Soquel Forest is within the augmentation boundaries. Acquiring in the 1860s about over 6,000 acres in here. All the way from the Loma Prieta mountain peak, all the way down to what's now the Olive Springs Quarry down here. He also acquired land over here, and with the idea of logging it and developing it as best he could. He was also, he was involved in so many projects throughout the county, including developing Old San Jose Road. That opened up the area to the settlers, made everything more accessible, and that was part of the old turnpike. So that really changed things. Let's see, next. So, this 1880s, he developed the Sulphur Springs Resort, which were in some of the earlier images. Wasn't a big adventure, big involvement, but 1880s to into the 1800s. Here, where it's now the entrance to the state forest, he had a small mill where he also had a small mill in this area that he operated, but he really wanted to have a railroad built, just like it had been done in St. Mark's. This was one of the last areas to be harvested in all of Santa Cruz County because it was so hard. But, and then I want to mention Fern Gulch is right here, again with Spanish Ranch here and Long Ranch. He passed away in 1913 before any significant logging could happen. So then his heirs sold the property, about 6,000 acres, to the Monterey Bay Redwood Company. It was this group that then built the big mill off of Olive Springs in 1925 and commenced logging up the canyon for the next 18 years. And during that 18 years, they harvested about 100 million board feet, clear-cut logging that I'll show you some photos of. And, just dramatically changed the watershed. And we were able, about 10 years ago, to talk to someone who actually worked for Monterey Bay Redwood as a teenager and someone in his 20s. And the first picture I show you, we talked to John, here he is at age 9, and his twin brother Ed. And then here he is about 10 years ago, Johnny Getzman. He was 99 at this photo. We were able to interview him and film and audio tape that interview for a couple hours and talked about some of the photos we had of him and his family, as well as the Monterey Bay Redwood operation. It was great, and I still have that rough audio, video, and the 4 photos that go with it. And anybody has the wherewithal to take that information and produce it into a more polished production, it would be a great service in history to the community. So talk to me at some point if you're available to do that. So we talked to Johnny about growing up in Soquel. He had a fairly prominent family with a hotel and a grist mill. Dropped out of school, probably right around the start of the Great Depression. And then he was an amazing person. Afterwards, after he worked for Monterey Bay Redwood, he went to World War II and did amazing things in both Europe and Japan. So he told us about his primary job was driving the lumber trucks, the product that was made from the mill, to various buyers throughout the Bay Area, throughout California. He even made a trip to Southern California, trips to Southern California. He said a lot of the buyers were either the government or military bases, and because this is now the Depression, right? And the company kept logging all these years in the 30s, but it was hard times, right? And they had trouble selling their lumber as much as they would have liked to. And then, so this is what logging looked like in the 1930s. They often used these spar trees with guy wires, and then the cables were attached to steam donkeys that then went up the canyon, and the logs were then pulled down. And here is an action shot with a log being pulled down to where it was then loaded onto trucks. And in the late 1930s, then they transitioned from steam donkey logging like this to actually crawler tractors that they then cut rough roads into the hillsides. Here's this, these are on the state forest. Redwood Company goes up to look. Tires, no power steering, not much in the way of brakes. They needed big guys to muscle their way down to the mill, right? And I'm sure there were some pretty harrowing adventures. And they operated year-round, muddy in the winter, dusty in the summer. Here's an action shot of the log truck in the 1930s. On the way to the mill, they crossed High Bridge. Some of you may have heard of that structure. Well, local landmark until it burned in 1970. But they had to get across the creek to get to the mill. Once at the mill, so this is off of Olive Springs, right? Here's the mill itself, the log pond. Olive Springs Road would be up here now. The log trucks come in here, they get dumped into the pond, and then these guys with their poles, direct the logs to the mill where they're raised up and they get sawed into lumber up there. Pretty amazing operation. So this went on for 18 years. Another shot of the mill operations. Again, here are the people directing the logs before they're going into the mill. Now we're in the mill itself, the head rig that goes back and forth with the bandsaw here cutting the lumber, and the next big, beautiful logs ready to roll down to be, cut into lumber. Another view, and the same thing with the bandsaw there, cutting a big slab. Pretty amazing work. Then, the lumber gets taken up on what's called the green chain, up into the lumber yard, where it is sorted and planed and dried. Here's the lumber yard where that activity is going on. And then you can see the hillside there that was logged, and it's kind of what it looked like in terms of a few trees. These are basically trees that were considered of no value to log, and that's why they were left. And then, of course, Soquel Creek down at the bottom there. And then, this is an image now. I think this is taken from about Long Ridge, across the canyon. Shows where they have already logged. We talked about those spar trees dragging logs down the hill. You can see where it kind of gouges out the hillside from where they dragged down the logs. And most everything is cut. And we're working our way up canyon, approaching Sulphur Springs. Here's one more shot with Sulphur Springs off in the distance here. And here's, this is where they've cut to. It looks like they felled the timber here, but they haven't logged it yet. So this would be in the late 1930s. Pretty dramatic. And then this is a shot of the Crazy Forest. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Crazy Forest. It's an area where the trees were knocked over in the 1906 earthquake. And they're, all every which way, jackstrawed, and it became a tourist attraction. It covered a couple hundred acres, but like the kind of the focal point was right near Spanish Ranch, right near Fern Gulch. And you'd go there, and it was kind of like a mini mystery spot, because you go there and you look up and you get disoriented. I don't know if any of you experienced that, but we use the trees for orientation, and when they go every which way, it's really disorienting. And people will go there for fun to experience that. This area was then eventually harvested in the late 1930s, early 1940s. So we go back to the lumber yard, again, the hillside cut over, mill in operation down there. And, now we're 1942, the war has started, and they have this enormous stockpile of lumber. And what saved this company was then the government stepped in and purchased all their their stocks, which allowed them then to pay off their debts and kind of break even operation. And so they then ceased operations in 1942. Before they ended operations, though, a movie crew from Hollywood came up and filmed the movie The Forest Ranger. They filmed it in 41, and the mill and the mill pond were prominent scenes in this movie, and it's a hoot. If you can get a chance to look at it, I recommend it. I'm going to try and get a copy of it, say, either working with Roger or the Porter Memorial Library. Here it is, The Forest Ranger. So Fred McMurray was the Forest Ranger. His office was, in the movie, his headquarters was actually, they used Big Basin headquarters. So it's cool to see that because, of course, Big Basin headquarters is now burned down. Here is Susan Hayward. She's Butch. She's the mill operator. And the other kind of romantic interest is the new city girl from out of town that comes in. And it's just hilarious. I recommend it. So we're going from 42, Monterey Bay Redwood Company owned the land for another 20 years. They did very small scale operations in the 40s and 50s, but continued to log the remaining old growth there. Here's probably circa 1950s by the crawler tractor there. Small operations where you'd take out, just a few people where you'd take out 1 or 2 loads of lumber a day, right, kind of thing. Then in 1961, the Chai Company bought the 6,000 or so acres of Monterey Bay Redwood. And they're the Setzer family. The owner of the company, Mr. Setzer, he had 3 kids, and he named the company CHY after using the first initials of his 3 children, Cal, Hardy, and Yvonne. So that's where Chai comes from. And as indicated, they owned the property from 1961 to 1979. And at that point, this is a map of their harvest operations in, mostly in the 70s. Again, still taking out kind of the residual old growth, maybe a little bit of second growth, but of course it wasn't, the second growth was still pretty young, right? If it was harvested in, 1930, it would be 30, no more than 40 years old. And they harvested a few million board feet. And then they sold the property in 1979. Their good fortune was, at that point, the timber market was at its peak. And so they got top dollar for this timberland. And they sold it to a local company called the Pelican Timber Company. Pelican came in, so 1979. In the 80s then, they had this huge debt that they wanted to pay off. They purchased about 4,500 acres from Chai. Chai held on to this area around the quarry, and then they held on to the very top of Loma Prieta Mountain, which they still own today, right? So Pelican had about 4,500 acres, and in just a few years, they developed timber harvesting plans for over half of that area. And that was kind of the most intense harvesting that had ever been planned in the Santa Cruz Mountains, certainly in recent decades. And because of that, it created a lot of concern about the environmental impacts. And that was especially kind of exacerbated because you will recall in the 80s, 82, 83, 86, we had these huge storms that did all kinds of damage here in the Soquel watershed. Soquel Village was flooded, Santa Cruz was flooded, and so people were concerned about environmental impacts. And there was a lot of pushback, lawsuits, and there was a movement to have the land purchased as a state park. Some were advocating for state parks to buy it. Some were advocating for it to become a state forest, as a working forest, right? The more the forestry community. And let me go to next is Pelican. So Pelican, their harvest plants were in this area. Ultimately, they only harvested a few hundred acres and not that much timber. But what also happened was that the market for lumber dropped out. So they bought high and they were trying to sell low, and it was just a total mess for them. So for one reason or another, then they developed plans. They wanted to develop the area into like 40-acre ranchettes. And I'm not sure if that was like to put pressure on the public or the government to buy the land, or if they were really sincere and thought they could get away with that. But the other thing that came about from this intensive plans for logging is that it began to have concerns about the cumulative impacts from logging, not just in any one harvest area, but what would happen downstream and what happens for all the different impacts combined. And it actually resulted in new statewide regulations as a result of the controversy that happened here. It said Pelican was in operation, owned the land from 79 to 88. So in 87, then Assembly member Sam Farr stepped in and wrote legislation that gave CAL FIRE, Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, the authority to create a new state forest, the Soquel Demonstration State Forest. It laid out the goals of the forest and how, just an example of some of the destruction that happened from those big floods, big storms in the 80s, right? Up in the rift zone of the San Andreas Fault, right? So Sam Farr authored what was then referred to as Assembly Bill 1965 that laid out the goals of this state forest that included watershed protection was a big one, given the circumstances, but allowed for timber harvesting, allowed for research and education, and it also required that CAL FIRE develop an advisory committee for the forest to help, and for that committee to help advise the department on creating a general plan for the forest. So now there was authorization to create a new forest, but no money to buy it, right? So the next year, 1988, there was this big settlement between the state of California and the Bank of America. The Bank of America owed the state something like $36 million. And that was used to buy 5 rural properties in Northern California, including 2,700 acres of the Pelican property. And the Nature Conservancy then took over management of all 5 of those areas, including what's now the Soquel Demonstration State Forest, for 2 years until it was officially transferred to CAL FIRE. So for a couple of years, Nature Conservancy was involved. Then now it's CAL FIRE, the state's fire department. And with that comes foresters who are managing the property. So it's very different than, say, a state park, where you have state park rangers, you have professional foresters managing it, and then you, as I mentioned, you have this really diverse set of goals for state forests that make it very different from a park. And of course, CAL FIRE is the state's fire department. So this is the photo from the first day I went to the forest in spring of 1990. This is, the entrance off of Highland Way. I was spring, it was a glorious day. I was very excited to see the place. And it was very beautiful, but because it was spring of 1990, it wasn't that long after the 89 earthquake, right? So we didn't get very far as we drove on the main road, right? And this was kind of emblematic of the roads in the area after the 89 earthquake, the rural roads. But it was still, I got the sense it was a gorgeous place, and I was really looking forward to working here. So then come July of 1990 is the ribbon cutting ceremony at this one patch of old growth on the forest, 11 acres at Badger Springs. Here's then Assembly member Sam Farr cutting the ribbon along with the director of CAL FIRE at the time, with some folks from the Nature Conservancy. and the State Lands Commission, and then local CDF staff, right? So, and then the Nature Conservancy was good enough to host this grand barbecue for the celebration. And I met some people there that, I had developed long friendships with ever since that picnic. So, I'm on the job now, and it's 1990. My job is to hire staff, to get an office, to obtain vehicles, figure out our budget, and set to work establishing this new forest. And some of our first priorities were restoring the roads, fixing slides. We also, making other improvements. We were interested in doing some educational activities. And then, of course, we had this huge job of developing the management plan for the forest. So, this is a skid steer putting down rock. There was a slide on this road that was removed, covering up bare soil with straw for erosion control. We built the helipad up on the top. Built a bridge so you can get across the creek all year round and reduce erosion. And then another part of this was really finding out what was there. We did multiple studies, at least 10 studies looking at all aspects of the forest, from the creeks to the greater watershed, looking at large woody debris in the creek, looking at, there was a geologic study that was commissioned, and then assessing the history and archaeological sites in the forest. And some, this is a chimney from a steam donkey that was found out in the forest. A big pulley from, we saw earlier. So some of these artifacts from before. Also assessing the fisheries population, which is primarily steelhead in Soquel Creek. We started annual surveys of the steelhead. Here's the old uniform. Really laid the foundation for assessing what was there. So then we could then better, inform what the general plan was going to be about. Reptiles, amphibians. I mentioned we did some educational activities. Talked about what a watershed is, Soquel Forest within the watershed. We did, had school groups come out to do tree planting. This is Rich Elliott, the first assistant manager of the forest. This is an exercise with fifth graders learning about soil formation. It's the components of soil from probably 30 years ago. And then we also started the planning process. And I think, the director appointed the advisory committee, and we met monthly with the advisory committee for about 18 months, working on chapter by chapter in this plan, developing the goals and the planned actions. And Patricia Marlin was here. I should have recognized her sooner. Hopefully she'll come back. Patricia is a mountain resident, lives on Highland Way, and she's been on the advisory committee from the beginning. So there she is, right there, in probably 1991. So we developed the plan, had some controversy along the way. This is Marcia McNally, who was a planner from UC Berkeley. We worked with her and Randy Hester. Marcia was here was presenting on a recreation survey she had done for us, interviewing the people that were using the forest. And then Marcia and Randy then, after the general plan called for additional planning efforts. And they helped us with an additional 5 or 6 plans that came out in the late 1990s. By 1995, we had developed the draft environmental impact report, and it became clear that we weren't going to get any farther in the plan approval until we settled the main issue of how much timber we could harvest in the forest. Clearly, everyone agreed that yes, we were supposed to harvest timber, and we're supposed to cover costs of operation, but there's a pretty broad range there that then one could still decide on. And ultimately, after a couple years of negotiations with the neighboring community group, we reached a compromise on the harvest. Very conservative harvest, but one that the foresters and the department could live with. And and of course, during this time, the forest is being used. The equestrians had always used the land in the 60s, 70s, and 80s during the Pelican days. Mountain bikers were out there early, and we still have some hikers out there. But also in the mid-90s, before the plan was ultimately approved, we had our first harvest in 1995, and where we showed people what we were going to do, how it went, and we did have field trips. We demonstrated horse logging. Randy Clayton, the teamster there, came to us and said, "Hey, you're going to have a harvest. Why don't we do some horse logging?" So we said, "Sure." That was incredible, very interesting. And we demonstrated other kinds of logging, like tractor logging and high lead logging. And we had, like I said, we had field trips to come out, and we talked about how the trees respond to thinning. They're growing in tight group, you thin them, and then they grow much faster. And that's shown in cross section of the trees when the rings get farther apart. So, and then finally in 1998, we have finalized the plan, and it gets approved by the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. They're the policy setting group for forestry matters in the state and oversee the actions of CAL FIRE. So now we're at 98, and we have these goals lined out. I've mentioned them briefly, and I'm going to go over them in a little bit more detail now. Watershed protection was a biggie, right? But it's really, we said, well, we're really trying to protect all the resources out there and do all kinds of different restoration work. Living in the Santa Cruz Mountains, it's a slide-prone area that we're constantly fixing slides and trying to make it so they don't occur again, doing lots of road work. This comes under watershed protection because we're trying to keep sediment from going into the creek, trying to protect the fisheries, replacing culverts, building bridges, as I mentioned, so we don't have to drive through the creek. And then this area is the main stem by Badger Springs. It looks great, it's beautiful, but when you look at it from a fisheries perspective, it doesn't have enough logs in the creek. There's like this one little log, they call it like a bowling alley sometimes. So we knew we needed to put wood back in the creek if we wanted to do enhancement for the creek. And so in more recent years, they developed this very ambitious project that actually put big wood in the creek, because if you put little wood in the creek, it ends up in Monterey Bay, right? So they actually had a big excavator. They identified clumps of redwood next to the creek that they pushed over with an excavator and put them in the creek. And then after one winter, you're starting to get more complexity, more pools that are critical for the fish habitat. Here is Ed Ory, who was, at that point, the assistant manager of the forest. Another primary goal is forestry education, forestry demonstration. And, we have people come out to the forest to talk about all the different topics, you name it, all different kinds of groups, school groups, college groups, neighborhood groups, groups from other states and other countries, and as I said, just all kinds of groups. This is the high school group that came out, and they were going to develop a self-guided audio tour of the forest, and which they did, which was really cool. It's a great program. Unfortunately, they came in a big bus, and they got to the entrance on Highland Way, and they couldn't get in because the entrance is too steep and narrow. So that's like another reason why it would be great to establish a new entrance to the forest that's more accessible, and also would provide for an opportunity to build more structures out there. Here is a group of fifth graders learning about trees. These happen to be about, this is from the 2024 field trip, where we actually got to see active logging. But as I said, the topics for the field trips are just, I've covered, so many different forestry, watershed, wildlife-related issues, and including when a couple years ago when we did the first burns, a small group came out to actually see what it was like to do a prescribed burn. The next big goal of the forest is fire protection. Here, this is Sulphur Springs burn from a couple years ago. And the fire protection starts with developing fire defense improvements, things like shaded fuel breaks, water tanks, helipads. These lines here these are existing shaded fuel breaks along our main roads and planned shaded fuel breaks, some of which, this is from the 2014 plan, some of which have now been completed, shows where the water tanks are and water sources and that kind of thing. So they've done a lot in recent years, putting in water tanks across the forest, developing water sources. And this is a great example of a shaded fuel break. Hopefully, you're becoming familiar with that term. It's the idea where you take out the dead and dying trees, you take out all the understory that serves as a ladder fuel to, you're trying to keep the fire on the ground when it comes, and you're trying to reduce the amount of fuel in this area as well, so that when the fire comes to this area, it drops down, it's more easy to put out. And that these shaded fuel breaks have been, successful in countless examples across California in recent years. And this is on Robinwood. It's one of the first shaded fuel breaks we put in the 90s. But this is a good image of what one looks like. And of course, that was also done along Summit Road a few years ago. Another way of reducing the fuel is with prescribed fire. This is so complicated to do, both mustering the resources, doing it on a non-burn day, when the fuel moisture is just right, not too dry, not too wet. Forests has started this process, and they are to be commended, but it's like 50 times more complicated than burning a grass field or chaparral, just because of all of it's involved. This is that burn as seen from the Spanish Ranch area on that day, and this is Sulphur Springs. Getting used to that view now. Forestry research is another goal, and that covers anything and everything you can think about forest watershed related. Right. Here's the weather station on the forest that's available online, but and then the research has been done by forest staff, by other CAL FIRE employees, by other agencies, by various groups, including schools, universities, you name it. There's probably been a couple hundred studies on the forest over the last 35 years, and it seems like there's always maybe a dozen ongoing studies at any one time. Just going to show you a couple examples. Here's a wood rat. Folks from UC Davis have been looking at tick-borne diseases, and they collect the wood rats, and then they take the ticks off the wood rats and study what diseases they're carrying. Here's another example of a combination research, demonstration, restoration project. This is our main road on the forest that was being threatened by Soquel Creek. And the idea was, let's do a project that would include enhancing the fish habitat by burying the bottom 20 feet of a tree that includes the root wad, have the root wad sticking out here to provide complexity for the fish habitat. And they just amazing project that has been very successful. Here are the root rods and logs waiting to be put underground, and then here's a sketch of, here's the creek, here's the logs sticking out, and here's where the road is, and the creek down below. And that's been in place for maybe 10 years now. It's worked really well. But, it's a combination of research, restoration, demonstration. Sustainable timber management, of course, that's another significant part of the program. How can we harvest timber in such a way that we can do it on and definitely into the future? harvesting with selective harvesting, doing a light harvest, and of course, the revenues then from harvest go back to the forest to fund all these operations. And so we, as I said, I think I mentioned the forest is roughly 80 to 90 years old, based on when the clear cutting occurred. It's virtually all second growth. Almost all the old growth was harvested. There are some really pretty riparian areas by the creek, and then there are some, mixed conifer and hardwood forests, and then some hardwood forests, and some are dense hardwood forests. So it's a mix of different forest types. We do, as I mentioned, we do harvesting. If we can stay on track, we harvest about every other year. This is from the 2024 field trip where the participants got to come out and see this fall this tree. Some active logging, skidding with grapple skidder, load the logs on the log trucks, and away they go. And I would like to suggest you, when you see these log trucks on the road these days, know that they were sustainably grown, sustainably harvested. This is where our wood comes from. These logs went off the big creek, and so when you go to Big Street Lumber, you're buying local lumber, and you can feel good about it. It's providing wood products and jobs, and also supporting the state forest. So, and meeting a basic goal of demonstrating good forestry. And if you want to learn more about what I've all talked about, this article I wrote a few years ago, History of Timber Harvesting, basically covers what I said. It's in a Museum of Art and History publication from a few years back. Recreation, of course, is another major goal of the forest. We're trying to do all these things on one piece of ground. It can get kind of complicated. Recreation, is secondary to our main goals of education and research, demonstration, but it happens out there. Here's the map of the forest. The trails, there's about 10 miles of trails out in the forest, about 20 miles of roads. Here's the entrance to the forest. It actually goes across private property initially, and then of course Highland Way. And Highland is so problematic with landslides. The only two places that are legal for the public to enter the forest are here, the main entrance, and up on, at the top Santa Rosalia, it borders Nicene Marks, and all the rest is private property. We have this goal, we've had the long-term goal, that if possible, we'd buy some of Chai's property in here and establish a new entrance to the forest that then would be much closer to people on this side of the forest. And it would also provide a place to build new facilities. So we'll see mountain bikers. There's references to Flow Trail, which is built, 2013 or so. It really put Soquel Forest on the map because it's just this world-class trail. Developing signboards for recreation users. This is from the 1990s when CAL Fire staff organized volunteers to do trail maintenance. That was eventually turned over to the nonprofit group that formed in the early 2000s, the Stewards of Soquel Forest. I'm actually on the board of the stewards and representing the stewards tonight. They then, for a number of years, organized volunteers to do trail work, but they're there to foster all of the goals, including ideally, the property acquisition. We built some trails. Some of you may recognize the McCrary's, Bud and Emma helped us with their trail machine. Very fun working with them. And these days, it's the Santa Cruz Mountains Trail Stewardship that does the maintenance of our trails. They are amazing. They build and maintain trails throughout the county and throughout the area, and they are amazing fundraisers. And they have raised millions of dollars to maintain the trails on Soquel Forest, build and maintain trails on Soquel Forest. And they organize work days for volunteers that they call dig days. They bring breakfast and lunch and coffee out, and they usually set a limit of about 80 people to do. And they're extremely organized, identify certain trail segments that they're going to work on,
And those work days usually fill up.
It's truly amazing. Maintaining the trails. They've gotten quite sophisticated in their trail development with these bermed turns that characterize the flow trail. And you can see why some people would really love to do that bank curve on a mountain bike. And then they celebrate at the end of the work season to thank their volunteers. Last major goal I'm going to talk about is protect old growth trees. As mentioned, that's in the enabling legislation. There aren't that many old growth trees out there. There is that 11-acre area of old growth. This is a photograph of Badger Springs area. Most of it goes up the hill, and then there are just scattered residual old growth trees across the forest. And then, so as we come across them, we'll tag them and map them and set them aside for protection. And I don't know if they're numbered in the hundreds, and they, some are big and some are small, and they all meet the criteria for old growth that's in the plan. And then this is another image from the 2014 plan that shows where Badger Springs is on the forest. I love this map too because it's LiDAR that shows the topography. And then along the major streams, major creeks, as we have an area called the Late Seral Succession Management Area. Late Seral Management Area, the idea is developing over time, having these forests in this area take on the characteristics more of an old growth forest. But just looking at the map in general, you see here's the creek down at the bottom. Here is Long Ridge. This is the Spanish Ranch area. Here is Amaya Creek and Amaya Basin with Amaya Ridge. The ridge between Nicene Marks and the forest basin here. And then you can...
What does Seral mean? Sorry.
It's, Seral is the succession. Seral is early Seral, middle Seral, like the older, well-established ecosystems, basically. Now we get up to the year 2000. We did a celebration of the 10-year anniversary. We did lots of fun activities, including bringing in a portable sawmill, and we had, a logger top one of our Douglas fir trees to create habitat for cavity nesting birds. We found that this is very successful in making habitat for woodpeckers and nuthatches, and within 5 years or so, there'll be nests in this tree, and the cavity nesting bird population will increase. And so that was, a demonstration that we did for the folks attending that day. And then, so we're still, I mentioned Randy Hester, all of these studies with Randy and Marcia, looking at forestry education, forestry research, what the plan would be for recreation research, what the programs would be like. And we said, well, these are things that were called for in the general plan. And it's like, well, if we really wanted to maximize the potential for the state forest, what kind of facilities would we want? They actually did a listening exercise where they talked to all different kinds of forestry leaders and community members to say, what would you like to see happen on the forest? And they did a study of different natural research education centers like Elkhorn Slough and Swamp Pacific Ranch to look at the facilities there, 10 sites throughout Northern California. And then they came up with the Forestry Education Center study, which was this ambitious plan to build facilities in the forest that would include both a visitor center, research facilities, places for researchers to stay, housing for employees, even an outdoor science school. From the very beginning, County Office of Education has wanted to build an outdoor science school on the forest. So this is still in the books, but who knows if it will ever happen. So now we're in 2012. Angela Bernheisel is the forest manager. Here's the advisory committee. I think that's Patricia there. Is Patricia back yet? No. And they're talking about the construction of the flow trail. And we're going through the process of updating the general plan. So it was completed in 2014. It's basically the same goals as the original plan, but the Board of Forestry wanted us to include in the plan all of what we've done in the previous years, all the research that we've done, all the improvements. So it ended up being a pretty thick document, and that's available online at the CAL FIRE website. So taking it now forward, I want to just cover a couple more things real quick because timber management, timber harvest was one of the big controversial issues. And I want to just show you, we start with projected forest growth over time. Down here are decades, and this is 1 million board feet, and we're in the second decade of this graph where we're growing about, on the forest-wide, about 2.3 million board feet. The plan calls for us to harvest about 1 million board feet a year on average. So we're harvesting less than half of what's growing, and the additional growth that we're not harvesting then adds to forest inventory, so that forest inventory increases over time. So just trying to assure people that we're not depleting the forest with the current practices, current plans. And then, we do harvest roughly every 2 years. This is a graphic again from the 2014 plan, so it doesn't include the more recent harvests, but you can see how they're laid out over time, starting with the 95 harvest and the 97 harvest. And the idea is you'd come back to that same area every 15 years or so, maybe longer, maybe shorter, just depending. And we're continuing to work our way up the watershed. Again, here's another LiDAR map. This is the area that I'll show you some photos of next, where they did this amazing project where they had a timber harvesting plan plus a fuel reduction project in the way of they got money through a forest health grant. Since the CZU fire, there's been just extra emphasis on the need to reduce fuel on the forest. It's always been part of the plan, but it was really brought home that redwood forests burn, they burn hot, they can burn hot, they can burn up completely. So it's, these kinds of accumulations we're trying to get rid of in shaded fuel breaks along like the main roads and ridges where they could be a place to stop a fire if one should happen. And, it's just this vegetation, when it dries out, serves as what they call a ladder fuel to allow the fires to go up into the crowns of the trees, right? And in order to reduce the fuel, for decades we've been doing chipping. We've done months and months and tens of thousands of person hours chipping probably. It works, but just in recent years we've been doing more pile burning, where you take that material and you put it into piles, run a fire line around it, and you set it on fire in the wintertime. Pile burning is now my favorite way of getting rid of all this accumulated fuel. And of course, you can do chipping on your property, and you can do pile burning on your property to make it more fire safe. It's just remarkably effective, and your end result is like park-like conditions, right? So pile burning, and then when you have bigger accumulations of material, then you probably need some heavy equipment. And CAL FIRE recognized that Sulphur Springs area where they planned to do a harvest was also just a mess in terms of dead down material like this. And they got a grant, what is known as a forest health grant, to remove this dead and down material. Here's a tree marked with blue. That was marked to come out as part of the commercial harvest. They marked trees that would come out as far as the forest health grant with orange. It was incredibly complicated to have these two separate operations within the same area. They pulled it off with a logging crew and a tree service company. This was in 2024, and it's an amazing story where they got rid of these huge accumulations. Some wood went out as for firewood that they were able to take out, and they brought in some of this big equipment that then has the capacity to make these piles and then ship it up, all automated. And here, it's big, expensive equipment, chipping and reducing the accumulation of fuels in the process, making the forest more resilient, more resistant to fire. And then here is right after this area was logged in 2024. It's still a little rough. But, that's what it looks like immediately after harvest. And by the fall, the redwoods stop sprouting. By winter, you get leaf drop, more sprouts, more plants coming back, starting to look less disturbed. And then by the spring, you see the harvest areas, for many people, they wouldn't even recognize that a harvest had occurred here. So pretty amazing work the forest staff has done. And here's a complicated chart, but as I'm summing up here, this shows harvesting and fuel management history in the forest. This is pretty up to date, shows the harvest areas in gray, shows where they've done pile burning in strategic areas like Long Ridge, on this ridge, along the road, and where they did harvesting and mechanical thinning, where they've done prescribed burns, including these 2 burns from this year, and then they tied in with work done by the local RCD in conjunction with state parks, try and these strategic fire breaks going forward. And then, hopefully in the short term, the new State Forest office is completed down by Alice Springs, and the new fire station. I'm told that I don't have any inside information. Last I heard, it was supposed to be done by the calendar year. See if we can't develop a new entrance in here. That's a much longer term project, but with that, I will take your questions. Thank you. Any questions at all? No?
What's considered an old growth diameter-wise?
Yeah, what's considered an old growth redwood? So we wrestled with that back when we were developing the first management plan. And we came up with 6 or 8 criteria, we looked at various definitions of old growth that we found, and we came up with diameter. I've forgotten what the minimum was, but it's just like a range, but big diameter, big limbs, like over 175 years old, slower growth. In general, old growth trees grow slower than young growth redwood. Crown shape. So it's a bunch of different criteria that we use then to say, okay, this is an old growth tree. We tag it and map it and leave it alone. So yeah, good question.
You got an 11-foot or an 8-foot diameter. Would that generally?
Generally speaking, yeah. Although it's pretty amazing when it gets to that big, definitely. But there are some 6-foot diameter second growth redwood trees on the forest. Where the rings are just really wide. It's just growing gangbusters. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a piece of property right by one of Heinz Mills up off of Redwood Lodge Road, where you have a mill. Mm-hmm. And there is an 11-foot, 8-foot, and a couple 6-footers. I was wondering if those had missed the mill, or they were just too awkward to get at.
Yeah, usually they were left, or they were too hard to get, or they were misshapen, broken tops, rot, something like that. And then you can see the size. Oh, another one is how deeply furrowed the bark is, size of limbs. And then you can core into it and estimate how old it is too. But yeah, that was right near Heinz Laurel Mill. Yeah. That was an amazing operation. Yeah. That took advantage of the railroad, that went through the Santa Cruz Mountains, right? Yeah. Another question?
Have you ever tried to identify those remaining trees that you pointed out, like in some of those photos? Because those are the old growths, but they're not.
I've always wanted to, but haven't. I wanted to find that spar tree. I've seen stumps of trees that were clearly used. You can tell that they were used for spar trees because of the way the cables cut into the different sides of the tree. And one of these days, I want to work on that some more. That would be really cool. Yeah. So, yeah, good question. Yeah, but in the back.
How does it work that the forest is used for recreation by the public? How does that fit to what the public is allowed to do?
So I don't know if you all heard, how does recreation work in the forest? It's public land, and we allow day use only. You can't drive in there. It's open to hiking and equestrians and mountain biking. And so it's just, an accepted public use of the public land. I don't know if that answers your question and it's, as I said, trying to get all these goals to work on the same piece of property can be challenging. And we try and keep the mountain bikers from building new trails. The Santa Cruz Mountains Trail Stewardships have been helpful in that regard because they make these wonderful trails. It's like, these are the trails, no more, right? So, there is conflict there, but we do the best we can, yeah. Yes?
But you mentioned, I was listening, it looked like there was only about 11 acres of old growth out of that whole area.
Yeah.
And I knew they came in afterwards and were picking and doing it, so that they got down to there was only 11 acres of old growth. Anybody go in there and see if that unique 11 acres has got any different microclimate or?
Questions about the 11 acres springs, that was protected by Monterey Bay Redwood Company. They consciously said, picnics here and we don't want to cut. And when they sold the land to Chai, in the lease agreement was, you will not cut this area. The creek talked about doing something like that, evaluating the old growth there versus the second growth. We've also even talked about comparing the forest in the state forest versus Nicene Marks State Park. That, too, is second growth, but it's much older second growth. It was harvested in the 1880s to 1920s, so it's right around when that harvesting stopped in Nicene Marks is when the state forest started. But fun things like that, be fun to do still. Would love to do something like that.
Is that area available for, if the old growth area available if you got a mountain bike? And
Yep.
how far is that from the parking area?
So it's about 5 miles down the road. So, and it's
So you
down,
get a park and then,
and it's downhill. But
can you hitchhike on the way back up?
not that I know of, anyway.
Just checking.
But it's worth going to, because it's not like some of the big trees, a big basin. They're maybe 6 feet in diameter. They're still big, but not super big, right? It's small but very pretty. It's one of my favorite places on the forest, and I really like the forest as a whole. So yeah. Other question?
Why the reticence you seem to mention against having more trails for mountain biking? Is there so much of the fraction of the users?
Yeah.
Why not?
Why not more? Because, I talked about how we have all these goals out there of research, education, timber harvesting, and the ideal situation is we wouldn't be impacting the trails with harvesting, but then again, the recreation trails wouldn't impact the harvest areas. So there's only just so much land out there. And it's like, what's enough, kind of thing. It's expensive to maintain. We're trying to limit the environmental impact of all the roads and trails. So, I think management is like, and it's an enormous pressure on the forest. There are medical aids, as we call them. There are mountain bike accidents out there on a regular basis. And the Loma Prieta volunteers are out there, bless them, on a regular basis, extracting people. And it's just a big impact that then is often in conflict with all the other goals of the forest.
Something totally different. You mentioned early on about the economy, what was initially kind of the idea that the harvest can cover some of the costs.
Yes.
Where does that stand now? So funding coming from how much?
The question has to do with Soquel Forest funding, right? In the long term, we have a goal of
covering all of the costs of the forest over time with the harvesting. But, those first couple of decades, we put so much time into developing the inventories and doing the planning efforts that the harvests were less regular than they are now. In the last 10 years, forest staff has been able to do harvests on schedule, and they've averaged 1 million board feet a year, and the timber market's been pretty good. So I can't tell you what percentage of costs that they've covered with revenue. But I would say not even a quarter in the 35 years. In the last 10 years, they've probably covered costs, with that regular harvest, right? So,
I guess redwood is pretty valuable right now.
pardon me?
The redwoods are high price.
Redwood prices really fluctuate. When they sold the timber 2 years ago, the state got a good price. Right, this last summer, the mills were buying, period. So this year was not a good year to sell your timber because whether you're in the state or private land, because they weren't buying. The markets are down, so it really fluctuates. But the forest staff will now go through this another planning process with updating the forest management plan again. But hopefully they can do that and still keep on track with all the other things that they've got going on. So, yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.